At 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the New Mexico desert lit up with a flash. Observers dropped to the ground. Some thought the sky had caught fire, but what nobody saw, what wasn't reported for decades, is what happened next. By the early 1940s, World War II had engulfed the planet, and a chilling possibility began to take shape inside the minds of Allied scientists. What if Nazi Germany was building a nuclear bomb? Reports suggested that German physicists were experimenting with uranium and reactor designs, and the idea of Hitler possessing a superweapon was enough to spark panic among Allied leaders. In 1939, Albert Einstein signed a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt warning of the potential for Nazi atomic weapons. That letter kick-started what would become the Manhattan Project, a vast, secret scientific and military undertaking that eventually involved over 130,000 people and cost nearly $2 billion at the time. That's over $25 billion today. The United States, joined by British and Canadian scientists, began building laboratories, enrichment plants, and experimental reactors at breakneck speed. And deep in the desert of Los Alamos, New Mexico, a team of the world's most brilliant physicists, including J. Robert Oppenheimer, Enrico Fermi, Richard Feynman, and Niels Bohr, worked tirelessly to design the bomb itself. But the problem wasn't just designing a bomb, it was choosing which kind. The Manhattan Project explored two paths: a uranium-based gun-type weapon, later used on Hiroshima, and a far more complex plutonium implosion device. The latter required precision explosive lenses, ultra-fast detonators, and near-perfect symmetry. There was no guarantee it would work, and worse, there were disturbing unknowns. Some scientists feared that a nuclear explosion might ignite the nitrogen in the atmosphere, setting off a global chain reaction that could cremate the Earth. Physicist Edward Teller even ran calculations to examine this possibility. The odds of total planetary destruction were deemed very low, but not zero, and they still pressed forward. For the plutonium bomb, theory just wasn't enough. They would have to test it. That meant creating the world's first nuclear explosion. They knew the risks, even the chance, however small, of setting the sky on fire. But theory could only take them so far. Now they needed proof, and to get it, they had to find the one place on Earth where they could safely unleash hell. Finding a place to detonate the most powerful weapon ever created was no small task. U.S. military officials needed a location remote enough to avoid public attention, large enough to contain a catastrophic blast, and accessible enough for construction crews, scientists, and heavy equipment. They settled on a desolate stretch of desert in southern New Mexico, part of the Jornada del Muerto, or Journey of the Dead Man. The region was hot, dry, and sparsely populated. Nearby ranchers raised cattle on the dusty land, unaware that the government had quietly seized the area for what was officially described as military ordnance testing. Construction began in earnest in early 1945. A 100-foot steel tower was erected to hoist the bomb into the sky, a method chosen to simulate an airburst detonation. Observation bunkers were built miles away. Hundreds of sensors, cameras, and instruments were installed across the landscape to record the blast's temperature, pressure, and radioactive output. But secrecy was paramount. The entire Manhattan Project had operated under the strictest wartime censorship. Most Americans had no idea the bomb even existed. Workers at Los Alamos didn't always know what their colleagues down the hall were building. Those working at the Trinity site were often told they were preparing a test for high explosives, nothing more. As the test date approached, anxiety rippled through the team. Oppenheimer, burdened with the weight of leadership, began to withdraw into himself. Fermi made quiet bets on how far the shockwave would travel, and some scientists still worried about the atmosphere ignition theory. Even as they helped prepare the bomb for detonation, they named the test Trinity, which was a cryptic name inspired by John Donne's poetry, selected by Oppenheimer himself. The name sounded almost holy, but there was nothing sacred about what came next. The bomb was armed, and in just moments, humanity would cross a line it could never uncross. At exactly 5:29:45 a.m. on July 16, 1945, the countdown reached zero. A pulse of white light burst across the desert, brighter than the rising sun. Observers stationed over 10 miles away instinctively dropped to the ground. Some described the sensation as being inside the sun. The steel tower that held the bomb had vaporized, and a mushroom cloud spiraled 7.5 miles into the sky. Sand fused into green glass, later named trinitite, while the air filled with radioactive dust. From his bunker, Oppenheimer watched in silence. Later, he quoted the Bhagavad Gita.
"Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds."
It was poetic. The test had worked. Mankind had weaponized the atom and crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. But even as the scientists and military men marveled at the success, a darker truth was unfolding. Fallout from the explosion began drifting north and east, carried by winds the meteorologists had misjudged. Plumes of radioactive ash floated over ranches, towns, and indigenous land, and nobody outside the project had been warned. The people of New Mexico, many of them Hispanic and Native American, saw a strange light in the sky that morning. Then came the shaking, the noise, and the illness. Livestock began dying. Hair fell out. Skin burned. Yet they were told nothing. There was no evacuation, no explanation. To this day, many residents of the affected area are still referred to as the downwinders. Nobody ever got any answers. And as rumors spread, the government launched something even more powerful than the bomb itself: a cover story. Within hours of the blast, rumors began to spread across New Mexico. People reported broken windows, loud explosions, and strange skies. But officials stuck to the cover story. A munitions dump had accidentally exploded at the Alamogordo bombing range. The truth, however, was far more dangerous than a warehouse fire. Radiation levels around the test site soared. Military scientists took measurements in the days following the explosion, but most data was classified. The public wouldn't know the full extent of radioactive contamination for decades. No warning had been given to the civilians living within 50 miles of the blast. Many of them farmers, indigenous communities, and small-town residents. There were no protective measures or relocation. The fallout exposed thousands of people to harmful levels of radiation. Cancers, birth defects, and mysterious illnesses would follow in the decades to come. But in 1945, the only concern was secrecy. The war was still raging. The bomb was now real. And within 3 weeks, it would be used, not in the desert, but on living cities. Scientists who had once worked eagerly on the Manhattan Project began to feel unease. Leo Szilard and others circulated a petition urging President Truman not to use the bomb on civilian populations. Their requests were ignored. In the weeks between the successful detonation in New Mexico and the bombing of Hiroshima, a quiet storm of conscience began brewing among the very scientists who had built the bomb. For many, the work had started as a race against the Nazis. Jewish scientists like Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and Niels Bohr had fled Europe to escape Hitler's regime. Their goal was to stop the possibility of a German atomic weapon, not to arm the United States with a doomsday device. But by mid-1945, it became clear that Germany was already defeated. The justification for continuing the bomb's development wasn't there anymore, and some were no longer sure they were on the right side of history. Szilard, one of the earliest minds to warn about nuclear chain reactions, began circulating a petition urging President Truman not to use the bomb on Japanese cities. He argued that demonstrating its power on an uninhabited area or giving Japan a chance to surrender would avoid mass civilian deaths and still end the war. Over 70 scientists signed the petition. Their names were kept secret at the time, and the petition never made it to Truman. Another internal report, known as the Frank Report, written by a group of Manhattan scientists in June 1945, raised similar alarms. It warned that dropping the bomb without warning would not only cause massive casualties, but also damage America's moral standing and trigger a dangerous arms race. The authors believed that the future of international peace depended on how the first use of nuclear weapons was handled. They were ignored. Meanwhile, J. Robert Oppenheimer, who had once been the driving force behind the project, began to withdraw into himself. He had led with brilliance and charisma, but after Trinity, something in him changed. Friends noted that he became quiet, reflective, even haunted. He too advised the government against using the bomb on cities, but by then, the decision had already been made. The momentum was unstoppable. Military and political leaders had invested too much, and the war machine was already in motion. What began as a theoretical science project had become a strategic weapon, and no amount of moral pleading would turn it back. The scientists had split the atom, but now they were beginning to realize they had also split the moral compass of modern warfare, and they would spend the rest of their lives wrestling with what they had created and what they couldn't stop. Meanwhile, the success of Trinity electrified military leadership. General Leslie Groves, who had overseen the Manhattan Project, saw the test as confirmation that the United States now held a godlike power. Plans moved quickly to deploy the new weapon against Japan. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would be next. But even as attention turned to the Pacific, fallout from Trinity was still poisoning American soil, and the people closest to it, the New Mexican families who had lived on that land for generations, were left to suffer in silence. The first victims of the atomic age weren't enemy soldiers, they were American citizens. And instead of helping them, the government chose to erase them. What happened after Trinity is one of the most underreported chapters in nuclear history. The blast had worked. That much was undeniable. But the US government made a conscious decision. Instead of alerting the public or helping those exposed, they buried the story. No health surveys were conducted in the aftermath. No official investigation into cancer rates. The Atomic Energy Commission, created in 1946 to take over from the wartime Manhattan Project, downplayed civilian exposure. Internally, they acknowledged the radiological impact, but publicly, they maintained that the fallout had no significant effect. Yet the data tells a different story. A 2010 Centers for Disease Control study found that Trinity released far more radioactive iodine-131 than anyone had realized, especially dangerous for thyroid cancer. The fallout cloud traveled across dozens of counties, contaminating crops, water, and milk. Children were especially vulnerable. Many drank contaminated goat's milk daily without knowing the danger. The people affected, largely rural, poor, and non-white, were invisible to the men in charge. To them, Trinity was a big win, not a human tragedy. The official line remained. Nobody was harmed, and the project had no domestic victims. That lie held for decades, and it wasn't until the 1990s that survivors and their descendants began organizing. They demanded recognition and compensation as part of the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, a program that aided uranium miners and nuclear test victims in Nevada, but not those downwind of Trinity. In congressional hearings, survivors told stories of mysterious illnesses, family deaths, and entire communities ravaged by cancer. They brought photographs, death certificates, and personal testimonies. But the government continued to deny any connection, citing lack of definitive proof. Trinity was a win for physics, but a moral failure of government. It revealed a disturbing precedent. If a population was poor, rural, and unlikely to fight back, it could be exposed, ignored, and forgotten. The first nuclear victims weren't in Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They were right there in America. The US had proved it could build the bomb. Now, it would show the world it was willing to use it. The Trinity test changed global politics overnight. Just 3 weeks after the explosion in New Mexico, the world saw what an atomic bomb could do when the US dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, killing over 200,000 people, mostly civilians. Japan surrendered. World War II ended. But something far more dangerous had just begun. The nuclear monopoly didn't last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb. By the 1950s, Britain followed, then France, then China. The arms race had begun, and the benchmark that all other nuclear tests would be measured against was Trinity. Nations scrambled to build arsenals for war and influence. Nuclear weapons became currency for power. The fact that the US had successfully tested and used a bomb gave it enormous geopolitical leverage. The Cold War became a high-stakes game with the threat of mutual destruction. There's something called the doctrine of deterrence. It's the idea that nuclear weapons prevent war by making it suicidal. This idea came directly from Trinity, but it was always a gamble. Accidents, miscommunications, or false alarms could trigger the end of the world, and they almost did, multiple times. And yet, even as nuclear warheads multiplied by the thousands, the people of New Mexico, the first exposed to nuclear fallout, were still asking the same question. Why was no one held accountable? More than 75 years have passed since that morning in the desert. Trinity is taught in history books as a technological milestone, a symbol of America's scientific might. But for those who lived downwind, who breathed the fallout, drank the contaminated water, and buried loved ones, the test was not a triumph. It was a betrayal. Generations of New Mexican families, especially among Hispanic and Native American communities, have documented unusually high cancer rates, autoimmune diseases, and birth defects. Yet for decades, the US government refused to acknowledge any link between their suffering and the test. In 1990, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, RECA, was signed into law. It provided financial compensation to uranium miners and downwinders of Nevada tests. But Trinity downwinders were excluded. Why? Because the Trinity test was considered a wartime necessity, not a public disaster. Of course, activists, scientists, and survivors have pushed back. They've gathered radiation data, organized town hall meetings, and testified in Congress. They've shown that the fallout from Trinity was far greater than previously admitted, and that people living nearby were unknowingly turned into experimental subjects. Recently, in 2023, the momentum started to shift a bit. After the release of the Oppenheimer film, public interest reignited, so lawmakers introduced bipartisan legislation in order to finally include Trinity downwinders in RECA. The bill passed the Senate, but the fight isn't over. Survivors are still waiting. Many won't live to see justice. But it's not about money. It's about recognizing that the first victims of the nuclear age weren't the enemies of America. They were its own citizens. Trinity was truly the moment the world changed. It marked the beginning of a terrifying new power that offered nations ultimate military dominance at the cost of humanity's long-term survival. It was the moment the line between science and warfare blurred forever. But Trinity was also a warning. The test proved that human beings could split the atom. But it also proved something else. That governments, even in the pursuit of national security, will sometimes sacrifice their own people, especially if those people are out of sight and without political power. The world remembers Trinity as a breakthrough. But for those who were there or downwind, it's remembered as the day the sky lit up. and no one cared enough to explain why. If you want to follow the story of Tsar Bomb, check out our video here.